we'll start in 5 minutes, and we are live on Facebook now.
Hello.
Good evening, Naneshwari.
Good evening, sir. Should we start?
I think we should wait for another minute. You know, the
Okay.
usual
Yes,
5-minute, the usual 5-minute delay
Yes.
before everybody is in. I think we've got a good crowd today.
At 7:05 we'll start, no?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Naneshwari ma'am, I think you can start by introducing Walter, and then we can take today's session on.
काय झालं अडकलंय का
Naneshwari ma'am, can you rejoin?
तुम्हाला ऐकू येते का ज्ञानेश्वरी
Hi, ma'am. I'll call her.
Hello.
otherwise somebody please take it over if Kurush is there Kurush why don't you take over
Yeah, but somebody will send me Walter's CV.
yeah
No, sending you on Facebook. Sorry, on WhatsApp. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
sorry Walter Mumbai is facing a lot of network issues because of heavy rains here since past 5 days
Oh yeah, no problem at all.
Social.
Kurush has just he could barely start his session today because of the Kurush
Purush has
is
sneaked
your
out of his house and driven 35 kilometers so that he's in a place where there's network.
oh really oh did you have to do that
Yes, it's okay. So
did you come to Live History's office in
Yes, yes.
oh
yes.
okay where is that office
Bandra.
oh
Okay, chalo. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very, very much for being with us for this special lecture by Dr. Walter Crist. Dr. Crist is a postdoctoral researcher with the Digital Ludeme Project in the Department of Data Sciences and Knowledge Engineering at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. He did his PhD in anthropology with a concentration in archaeology from the School of Human Evolution and Social Change at Arizona State University in the US. His dissertation focused mainly on changing social aspects on board game play and social hierarchy developed and how this change in board game play and social hierarchy development in Bronze Age Cyprus interacted with each other and the repercussions thereof. He's one of the authors of the book Ancient Egyptians at Play, which is a very well-known book now in the game world. Board games across borders. His fieldwork has led him to Cyprus, Greece, Turkey, and Azerbaijan, where he has collected data on ancient games. His main research focus is how various different social processes such as trade, social complexity, social collapse, all of these change the ways in which people play games. So I'm not going to keep you all apart from Walter for more than half a minute more. Thank you very, very much, Walter, for being here with the India Study Center Trust, despite all the technical hangups that we've got going on here. Welcome to the InstaCent Trust and take it away.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm very excited to have this opportunity to be able to talk to everybody here. When I found out about the Project Kelia a couple of months ago, it was immediately obvious to me how our projects overlap, and I was excited to learn more about what you all were doing there. And so now I think I thought I would share what we're doing so that you all can know what we're doing. So let me share my screen for the presentation. Okay, so as we just found out, I'm part of the Digital Ludeme project, which is organized and led by Cameron Brown here at Maastricht University. What we're doing is we are taking historical evidence for games and trying to figure out how they might have been played in the times when they were actually being played by people. And we are coming from a perspective of European and American scholarship in ancient games. So a lot of what we're dealing with are sources that are in English and other European languages, because those are the ones that I can read, and taking that which we know from those sources, putting them into a games database, figuring out what it is that we know about these games, and then figuring out how we can fill in those holes and using artificial intelligence to test these games and see if they're playable and evaluate which ones seem to work better than others. So to start with a little bit of an overview about games in human history, we have evidence for about 5,000 years of people playing games. The earliest games that we can definitively say are games come from Egypt from about 3000 BCE. There are other artifacts which go back even further, about 9,000 years ago, that could be games that come from what's now Israel. But it's uncertain whether those artifacts are actually games. So definitely for the past 5,000 years, we have evidence that people were playing board games. And as we found out, as has been documented, people from all around the world play games in all kinds of societies. People who are hunter-gatherers, people who are nomadic herders, people who are Bedouin, people who live in empires, people who live in cities, people who live in villages. All over the world, people play games. But what's interesting about the games that we're focusing on in our project which are traditional games, are that these games are a little different from the way that we kind of think of games today, in that people never wrote down the rule sets for the games. So people would always learn these games from their parents, from their friends, from someone they knew, from someone that they were interacting with, rather than going to a store, buying a game that has the rules written down on it and learning it that way. So as a result of this, for the majority of these games, we don't have any written record of the set of rules of how they were played. So what we have to do is we have to infer the rules from other roundabout ways, such as finding artifacts that show us what the board is, or how many pieces were with it, or what dice they used, or looking at pieces of art. I'll go into that in a little bit more detail later. And since people have realized that games were something that people played in the past, people have tried to reconstruct games and figure out how these were played, but it has always been a subjective kind of a practice when people would make up some rules that they think were fun or appropriate, but often not based in any kind of evidence or reality. So this here is just a timeline of some of the games that we've selected from our project that show the span of games that we are covering here. And as you can see, that they cover the entire world and from the past 5,000 or more years. These are some of the major games, and the dots here show our earliest evidence for when these games were played. Of course, these games could have been played before that as well, but we don't have anything that tells us that that game existed at those points. So there's been a long tradition of people who study games in both anthropology and in archaeology. And up until about 1990, people were mostly focusing on trying to document what these rules were and then connecting them between places to see what the origin of games were. So for instance, one of the earliest people to study games was an Englishman named Edward Tyler, who went to Mexico, and well, he didn't go to Mexico. He studied games in Mexico and noticed that this game Patoli, which was played by the Aztec people in Mexico, was very similar in form to the game Pachisi, which we're all familiar with from India. And he said, well, these games look so familiar, they must have come from some kind of contact between Mexico and India in the past. And this was a very popular kind of approach to cultural studies in that time, where people thought that something would be invented someplace and then travel through trade or contact through the rest of the world. Since then, we have kind of moved away from this kind of mindset and realized that people can invent similar looking things in different places at the same time. Seems obvious to us now, but it wasn't back in the time. So in fact, we can tell that the game Patoli, from the material evidence that we have, it seems to actually be a little bit older than the evidence we have for Pachisi in India. And there's no other kind of evidence for any kind of connection between the two cultures at that point in time. So there's really no reason to think that these games are all connected. They just kind of look the same. Oops, going the wrong direction. There we go. So the archaeology of games has kind of, since 1990, we've been applying more of the kinds of methods that archaeology has been using since about 1950. Because there's a lack of evidence of games, because they often don't leave much material there, games have kind of been abandoned by anthropologists and archaeologists from kind of the theoretical methodologies and scientific methodologies that have been applied to other things like pottery and stonework and all kinds of other things. This is partially because there's a lack of evidence of games, but also because people have sort of pushed games off as something that's not important. Like who cares about what people are doing for fun? That's not what's important. We want to know about how people are getting food, how they're surviving, how they're living, these kinds of things, how they're gaining power. But with some examination of games, and I won't get into this in too much detail, since about 1990, we were kind of realizing that games influence and are influenced by all of these other social processes that go on and have another layer of information that can be added to them. So we've kind of de-emphasized that kind of old diffusion approach to games where they start in one place and then go and spread all around the world. But there has been little work done, broad work done on games, except for within specific cultures. So the digital looting project that I'm working on now was started by Cameron Brown, who had the idea that we could use artificial intelligence and other kinds of computational methods to reconstruct the rules for these games based on what we know about them, and also see if we can model how they do travel between cultures. Because while the old model of cultural diffusion is kind of unfashionable, we do recognize that things do pass between cultures. So the goals of this project are to model and reconstruct and map the tradition of games across the world. And our team is led by Cameron Brown, who is a game AI specialist and also game designer, who has designed a number of games that can be played. And we also have Eric Piet and Matthew Stevenson and Dennis Summers, who are our game AI specialists, who are designing the game playing software and the user interface and the artificial intelligence that will help us to analyze the games. And then I am the archaeologist who's supplying the historical and cultural content for the project. So how is this different from what we were doing before? Well, and what people have done in studying games. So because archaeologists and anthropologists haven't really studied games heavily, there are nevertheless a lot of people who are very interested in games. And so they have kind of on their own tried to fill in the gaps in what our knowledge is. And they've often done this rather creatively. So if you Google any historical games, you'll find a lot of information out there on the internet, but a lot of it is based on misunderstandings and fabrications and just complete nonsense in some cases about games. So we want our project to be explicit that all of what we're saying about games is based on solid historical evidence. And that means primary sources that tell us something about a game, whether it's the location of the game, the time when the game was played, or something about the rules or who was playing the game, all kinds of things. So these reconstructions that we will do, and I will talk in a little bit more about how we're going to do that, will provide new kinds of evidence for historians about how these games were played, potentially, and also maybe the interactions between cultures that were there. And we're taking a scientific and quantitative approach to this so that it's very empirical, and we can also critically evaluate any kind of game reconstructions for historical accuracy and also for how it plays as a game. So to do this, we are choosing what we are calling the 1,000 most important games throughout world history. Of course, important is a very broad term. What does that even mean? So we have certain criteria that a game must meet in order to be included. And we're rather flexible about what we're calling important. So the game has to be documented by some kind of concrete historical evidence. It has to be given a geographic location and a time range, not necessarily a single point in time, but at some kind of idea of the time in which it was played. The games were not commercially invented for sale. So since the Industrial Revolution and in different times in different places, games have become a thing that people invent to sell them, or because they think it's intellectually interesting to create a game that functions in a certain way. And then they're sold, the rules are written down and sold to people all across the world. This kind of process new process of learning games and dispersal of games is completely different from how people traditionally learn games. So we want to ignore those kinds of things because it's a completely different phenomenon from what we're trying to model. So what this means for us is mostly any game that has been documented before 1800 is automatically included in our database if we think it's important, but also games after that point, they can't have a known inventor, they have to be demonstrated to be a part of a culture, and all other kinds of criteria. So we are dealing with games from 5,000 years ago up to present, but there's kind of variations in the kinds of games that we're looking at. Typically, we're looking at games that involve more than just chance, so strategy games that involve different kinds of ways in which you play. But we are including games that are mostly chance-based in their game mechanics. It's like Jan Chopar or the game of Goose, which are only completely based on chance on how you roll the dice and where you land. But they are such historically and culturally important games that they have to be they are one of the most important. So the Ludemic game description is something that Cameron Brown has kind of invented a new programming language for our software where you can play these games that breaks games down into what we call ludemes, or like a game meme, that basically encapsulates an idea about a game. So it encapsulates what the board size is, how it's shaped, particular kind of action and moving or capturing boards, which is completely different from how game description languages are now for software, because they're human readable. So humans can read this and understand this. This here is, well, I'll tell you in a minute. it's important that it's human readable because it also models how humans actually conceive of games rather than how you can do it to make the game, that make a computer play the game. I don't know why all this green stuff is showing up. Anyway, so the game description language is kind of the industry standard, and this is what the game of tic-tac-toe looks like. It's a huge, long description that is kind of incomprehensible to humans. But in the new Ludemic language, this is how it looks. So the game's name is Tic-Tac-Toe. It's got white and black players. The board is shaped with square tiles that are shaped in a square. And it's 3 by 3, and you win when you get all 3 pieces in a row. Much easier to understand. And it helps us to be able to reconstruct games, because when one of these is missing, we can then decide, okay, maybe there's something that goes in there, and then we can substitute them and test them. So Ludi is the game playing software that is based on a library of these ludimes that we compile from documenting all of the games that we have found, and the game database, which are basically the cultural information about the games. And these include the descriptions of what the games are and the historical data about who was playing the game, where it was played, when it was played, all this kind of stuff. And we have games that are already playable. I will show you the software toward the end, and it can be downloaded at ludi.games right now. We've just released the software about 2 weeks ago in its complete version. So for historical game reconstruction, we will use the Ludi software to do this. Cultural transmission theory, which is based in biological evolution as it applies to cultural aspects, cultural practices, explains that games are transferred between person to person, and in that transference, the ideas that are transferred can sometimes change. When someone else plays a game, they might change something about it, and the way that you model this can be done similarly to evolution. And the ludimes in the language can be kind of considered the DNA of the games that are being transmitted. So when you have games that are you're transmitting ludimes that are actions and board sizes and these kinds of things, and then when you find it in the historical or archaeological record and some of those pieces of the game DNA are missing, you can then try to substitute that back in and model how the games might have changed through time in similar ways that you can do this with ancient DNA. And so to do this, we can calculate the Ludemic distance, meaning the number of steps that you would have to take to change from one game to another, to see how different games are and how they might be able to change from one to the other. And then a couple of approaches to this that have been done before are computational phylogenetics. It's developed from biology that measures the evolutionary relationships between different entities. People in biology do this for species, but people have done this for games. And you can see in this figure here, how this has been done for the different kinds of games that are related to chess. And this is the way that it has been, that the phylogeny, the family tree basically has shown that Chaturanga from India is the ancestor, and how all of the other games have derived from that. It also has been used in linguistics, which is more similar to how games function. But it gives us a representation of a logical way that games might have been related to each other or derived from one another. And we also have to deal with horizontal transmission. So in biology, DNA is transferred from a parent to a child. But for games and other cultural things, it's not a parent-to-child relationship, it's a peer-to-peer relationship. So you're not necessarily getting the DNA from 2 different parents to a child. You're getting the information from one person, or maybe maybe 10 people have taught you the same game, and you might take different things from that game. So it requires a different kind of conceptualization, and it's better for reconstructing how cultural things, including games, are transferred. So we do have a lot of challenges for historical reconstruction. Data are sparse, as I've mentioned several times already, because games are often not, the rules weren't written down. The actual boards and pieces and things often don't survive. A lot of people play games on things like wood or on textile, or just drawing the board in the ground, things that are not recovered very often archaeologically, so we don't have evidence for it. And the evidence that we have for reconstructing games are often coming from many different sources. So you'll have a board for a game, and then you'll have another text where someone has written in a story that they've written a tiny little paragraph or sentence that mentions something about how a game was played. And then you have a painting of people playing a game that shows different other things about the game. You have to compile all of this stuff together in order to get a full picture of how a game might have been played. And depending on what kind of evidence it is, some are more reliable for providing certain kinds of information than others. And we have some examples of games that are, or things that might be games that we don't know if they're games. So this picture that you see here is what some people think is a round Merrill's game. So Merrill's game is basically a 3-in-a-row game similar to Tic-Tac-Toe. This pattern that you see here is found at a lot of ancient Roman sites throughout the Mediterranean. But no Roman source ever mentions this game. This is often found alongside some other games that are mentioned in Roman sources. And people have provided reconstructions that say this could have been a game, but is it really? We don't know. So a lot of the information that exists out there on the internet, and even in some publications, is speculation. So our project is using evidence-based historical data. So each game that we have in our database is associated with a suite of pieces of evidence in our databases, whether that's an artifact, a text, an artistic depiction, or an ethnographic observation of a game. These things all provide some kind of information about the game. Some games will have many, many pieces of evidence. Right now, we'll see it later. We have a game that has over 300 pieces of evidence. Some games will only have one, where it was only documented in one place at a certain time, and that's all that we know about it. And the evidence, the ludemes that we get from that evidence, and the historical information that we get from that evidence support connection between ludemes and the particular games. And we have uncertainty factors for each kind of evidence based on if it's complete, if it comes from, if it doesn't mention the name of the game, if the rules are incompletely described, all kinds of things where we take into these contingency factors for that are just everywhere in any kind of historical analysis. So some of the basic information that we're gathering are the names of the games, the locations of where games are, the rules as much as we can find, the social status of the people who played the games. This is important for modeling how games might have traveled between cultures, because if certain classes or ages or genders of people are playing games, that might determine who they're interacting with and what kinds of social interactions are influencing games, and might rule out certain kinds of games from being transmitted. So for instance, children's games might not travel through intercultural trade that often because traders aren't playing with children, usually, you would think. And also the spaces in which people play games are also important, because sometimes games are only played in homes or in certain ceremonial spaces that everyone might not have access to, especially people from other cultures. So that might also be a mitigating factor for how for how easily this game might have traveled between cultures. So let me talk about a couple of different kinds of evidence that we're looking at. So artifacts are some of the most numerous that we're looking at. So these are the actual physical manifestation of something that was used to play the game. So for example, the board, this one here from the Tomb of Tutankhamun. Also game pieces and dice also fall under this category. They can tell us about the date and location where the game was played, if it was, if the archaeological site or the place where it was found is adequately documented. Can tell us what the board of the game looks like. One of the crucial parts of reconstructing a game is knowing what the board looks like. And it might have certain markings on the board, which might tell us about certain spaces where something might happen if a piece lands on it. The gaming equipment, which are the pieces and the dice, how many pieces were there. The different kinds of pieces might be able to tell us how many different players were playing the game. The different dice, what kind of dice were used, can be really important for determining whether a game actually works. So if you're using 2-sided dice versus a 20-sided dice, that really influences the way the games are played. And if the games are well documented from a good archaeological excavation that was been done scientifically, you can also tell things about social status, gender, and the places in which games were played. In some cases, evidence is fragmentary, where you only have a piece of it. So this here is a piece of the Egyptian game Senet, which was found in the Arizona State Museum, where you only have 3 and part of a 4th square from the board. We can tell this is a Senet game because the markings here are very diagnostic of this game. So the last 4 spaces of this game have a convention for the kinds of markings that are there, which is the 3 birds, the 2 people, and then the falcon in the last space. That helps us to identify that this game is Senet and once was 3 rows of 10 spaces. And we know that from having found many, many Senet boards from Egypt. So in some cases, you're able to tell that a piece of a board belongs to, you're able to identify what game it belongs to. But if these squares were empty, then we would have a much more difficult time doing that. So we also have textual evidence, which is hugely important for us when it's available. So these are primary texts, so texts written by somebody who was living at the time the game was played, who tells us something about the game, whether they were writing down the rules, which sometimes did happen, though it was rare. As in this case, we have one of the kings of Castile, which is part of Spain, who wrote the Libro de los Juegos, the Book of Games, who wrote down rules for a whole bunch of different games that he really liked. So this is a really good source for us for the rules of some games from medieval Europe. This is a very rare thing. People rarely did this. But we also have other kinds of texts where someone, where we have a law, for instance, that was issued by some government that says, or a religious authority also often, which will say, oh, this game is forbidden. So we have the name of a game and we know that it exists at that point in time because this law identifies it. So that gives us a place and a time and evidence for the existence of a game in a certain place. And we have literature where people talk about games all the time. That also provides us another data point for where games are. And sometimes they'll say something about the rules of a game also, which will give us information. So this is an example of a text. This is the oldest real document that was made specifically for describing the rules of a game that we know of. So it comes from Iraq, dated to 177 BCE. It describes this game here on the right, which is known as the game of 20 squares. We don't know its ancient game. Nobody ever wrote that down. But from this tablet, we have all of this information about how the game was played. So in blue, you see it describes 5 different game pieces. So we know that it had 5, each player had 5 pieces. In the orange, we see that it describes an ox astragal and a sheep astragal. An astragal is the ankle bone of animals with hooves. So, and they have 4 distinct sides and are often used in many cultures as dice. So these are 2 different dice that are used for this game. And then in red, it tells us something about what happens when you land on the pieces with the rosette, that are these circles that you see in the board on the right, which indicates to us that when a piece lands on that, the piece is safe from something that would happen to it. And then in the green, we have some contextual information about who wrote this tablet, that it was written for someone from Babylon, the year that it was written, and that it was someone from kind of a noble background. So we know their social status and where and when this was written. So this is an illustration of all the kinds of information you can get from a text when you have a good one like this. In other games, we have smaller pieces of text where you have to kind of cobble things together. So this is the game Ludus Latrunculorum from Roman times, which is mentioned in several different Roman sources, but never completely described in any one of them. So Ovid at the top tells us that the pieces move in a straight line, that if you surround an enemy piece on 2 sides, that enemy piece is lost, and that pieces can move forward and backward. Another text tells us that pieces can move over a long distance, not just to the next space, but they can move far. Another one describes the board, which then gives us the opportunity to identify artifacts, which you see on the right here, that fit that description. And then other sources confirm some of the other ones where pieces can be captured between 2 enemy pieces, and then pieces can go backwards. You can also win by blocking off the enemy somehow. And then the last one here tells us that an idea of how winning is achieved, and he says that he wants the other player to know that he's 1 man ahead of him. So it seems to be that having more pieces on the board is a winning condition. So while it doesn't give us a full picture of how the game was played, it gives us some hints, and then filling in the holes in those lootings that we get from these hints allows us to reconstruct a game. And then we have artistic depictions, which are scenes of people playing games, which can tell us about, what kinds of places people were playing, what other things were going on while people were playing, who were the people that were playing, and other kinds of things like that. This is a picture you can see in the 3rd register from the top, the people playing games. This is from Egypt from about 4,500 years ago, where people are playing games in celebrations of the goddess Hathor, associated with a person's funeral, a person of some elite status, because this was in a rich person's tomb. And we see other examples here, one from 18th century Europe of some Turkish women playing a Mancala game. So this shows us that women played this game in Turkey, or it wasn't unusual for women to play anyway. And then others, like this ship model from Egypt on the right, they show us 2 sailors playing a game on a ship, but the board itself is not very indicative of what game it is. There's just some lines there. We don't know what game it was. Often artists were not very rigorous about depicting the board exactly as it was. They just wanted to show us that it was a board game that they were playing, not necessarily a specific game. So there's often, this is another kind of layer of uncertainty that we are dealing with here. And then we have ethnography, which is when someone goes to a culture and looks and observes people actually playing the game and sometimes learn it themselves. And this can be the most detailed source of games for us, because they often will tell us the full set of rules and who was playing them and when they were playing them and in what places they were playing them. And sometimes they'll talk about the history of the game. So these can be really detailed sources. So this one, I won't go into too great of a detail what this is, but this is an ethnography that includes a Mancala game from Borneo that tells us in all the great detail about who's playing the game, how it was played, all of the different rules and how you win and all of that kind of stuff. So it can be really a wealth of information for us. So this is kind of the conceptual diagram of our database, where we have ludemes, which are the individual pieces of DNA of the games, which make up rule sets, which is when you have a group of ludemes together that function, that can be played, that make up a game, which is a cultural thing that is, it has more than just the rules associated with it. It's associated with a culture, a time, and all kinds of other things. And these are all supported by the evidence that we are gathering. And then I just want to take a second to show you our database. So this is ludi.games, which you can go to this at any time. This is open on the internet. If you go to our games here, these are all of the games that we have in our Ludi software. These are both traditional games and modern games. We've included modern games in the software because the software is able to do much more than just play these traditional games. And we've had to use some of these modern games to work out some of the complexities of working out the Ludemic game playing language. But we have 563 games in the software now, of which 358 are in our database for the digital Ludeme project that will support our game Reconstructions. And you can browse this on your own time, but 128 of these are implemented in the database already. And then I just want to show you the visualization of these games. So these here are the games as they're located on the world map, color-coded by the type of games they are, whether it's a race game, a hunt game, a war game, a Mancala game, which we're calling sewing games. So we can, if we want to zoom in, let's zoom in on India. You can click on one of these dots that'll show you what game it's representing in roughly the place where we have our earliest piece of evidence for it. This game here, and there's a picture of what the board looks like. So if you click on that, it takes us to the entry in the database, which has a picture of the game as it looks. We have a short description about what we know about the cultural aspects of the game and the rules as we know it, and then where it comes from, and then the map that represents where it came from. And this is the region where this was an ethnography where someone documented it. So if you click on the region, or it might be a point there, it'll tell you all about that piece of evidence. So this is an ethnography from Nagaland from 1921 that supplied us with all of these rules. And then under content, there's the actual quote from the ethnography that describes it and the reference. And we also have the sources for this game. So the actual ethnography where we got this evidence we can click on that. And in some cases where it's available online, if it will load, yeah, it'll take us right to the original source. And in other cases, and so it'll take us to, so we have as sources, we have where the actual evidence came from, but also any other kind of book about games that might have talked about these. So this is this famous book, History of Board Games Other Than Chess. That's not available online, but if you click on it, it goes to WorldCat, which is a tool that helps to locate books in a library. So if we go back to the website, we can look at the game Senate, which gives us a, so we're very much in progress as a project at the moment. So we don't have all of the evidence for all games compiled yet, but Senate is our most complete set of evidence here, the famous Egyptian game. And we have the description here. These here we have, so many games will have different rule sets because, especially for these ancient games, because different people have suggested different rules, and we can evaluate those using the software that I'll show you in a bit. But we've also identified, because of the different boards and different kinds of depictions and texts that we have, different kinds of boards and that might require different kinds of reconstructions. So we've identified these here, and then we will later try to reconstruct them. But then here's our evidence for Senate. You can see there are many points all throughout Egypt and the eastern coast of the Mediterranean and in Cyprus, and then many sources here. So that's kind of fun to look around if you are interested in games, and we will keep building on this as we keep adding more games. Like I said, there are 310 here right now, but we will go up to 1,000 by the end of the project. We also have another world map that shows where all of these pieces of evidence are from, which you can see here. So these are actually where each artifact, each piece of textual evidence, each artistic depiction comes from. And it kind of shows you, these are color coded by date. So the darker dots are the older ones and the lighter ones are newer ones. And then the shape tells you what kind of evidence it is. So the circles are artifacts, triangles are art, squares are text, and diamonds are ethnography. So if I can just go back to the presentation. Here we go. Okay. So artificial intelligence will help us, using all of that evidence and all the lootings that we get from that evidence. Artificial intelligence will help us to reconstruct games. So what the artificial intelligence does is it kind of, in my historian's understanding of it, Cameron Brown is watching, so he will probably critique my explanation of this, but I'll do my best. Basically, it creates a tree that has every possible state of the game. So every configuration of the pieces and each step of the game that could possibly be made. For many games, this is...
So you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Let me go back. Okay, so artificial intelligence makes a tree of every possible game state in the game, and it then evaluates based on how the different players in the game move. It will evaluate the best way to win. So because these things can be infinitely huge, there are different ways that different kinds of artificial intelligence sample that tree that models the game to figure this out, and some work better for some games than others. So, and then it can generate all these kinds of metrics that we can look at to see how the game actually works when it's being played. So we will do probabilistic reconstructions of these games. So we define constraints on these reconstructions by looking at the evidence and saying, these are the things that we know about the game that cannot be changed. So those are our constraints. And then they also help us to identify where the gaps are. Like we might not know the directions in which pieces can move, or we might not know if pieces can be captured or not. So then we can substitute ludemes. We can use ludemes that come from other games from the same place, or places that we know a place was in contact with, or from ludemes from a different time that we have documented for the same place, where we think that there might be some kind of historical connection between ludemes, and then evaluate it with the artificial intelligence to see if it actually works as a game. And some of the metrics that we can use to do this are drawishness, which is when you're playing a game and it kind of comes to a place where nobody can actually win. Endless loops are another thing that are generally avoided with a good game. These are where you can't make any other moves that produce anything other than a continuous loop in the game keeps happening over and over, and there's no way to escape it. So if a reconstruction produces that, it's probably not very good. Playing time can be another metric that we can use. This is often culturally based, but if a game goes on for days and days and days, it might not be the best reconstruction, but there might be some kind of leeway in there. There might be some games that are intended to be very long. And then also bias is important. Bias is when there's a sort of favoritism to the first player that moves, for instance. The first player that moves is often the first winner. That might not be a great game or a great reconstruction of a game. So we can maximize the reconstructive ability by eliminating as much as we can these kinds of metrics in our game reconstructions, and also maximizing our historical accuracy by holding to the evidence that we have. And then let me now show you our Ludi software. So here it is. You can download this from the website, ludi.games. There's a tab that has downloads. You can download it there. It works on PCs and Macs. So this is the game Chaturanga. It has the rules over here to tell you how to play. Over here you have the two players. Right now it has two different AIs to play. And
but it is not visible. We are still seeing the we are still seeing the probabilistic. Yeah, now it's visible.
Now it's showing. Okay, sorry.
Yes.
So this is the game of Chaturanga, which is the ancestor of chess and all of the different kinds of games that are like chess. It has the rules over here, and you have the two players, and you have the drop down, which has a bunch of different kinds of AIs that you can use to play the game. And also, if you scroll up the top, you can select human if you want to play it yourself, and then you can move and have the AI move also. So we have a bunch of different games here. So under File, Load Game, it shows you all of the different types of games, and then you can look at the game there. But you can also search for games just by typing here, and then it'll go if you want chess, or if you want, show this game that we looked at earlier from the evidence. We can select two AIs and we can make them play against each other. So right now I have in the settings to show how the AI is evaluating the rules. So the different arrows that show up here, if they're blue, it shows what the AI thinks is a good move. If it's red, it thinks it's a bad move. And the bigger it is, the wider it is, I should say, indicates how good or how bad it thinks it is. And then this can go on forever. And then we use the output of this to evaluate the games. Just stop it. We have, for instance, this game Ludus La Trompulorum that I talked about, which we don't know what the rules for this game are, but there are several people who have proposed rules. So under options, we have all of these different proposed rule sets. So this one selected here involves a phase of the game where the players place the moves on the board. But another rule set here has the pieces already on the board. So we can have the AIs play these games and evaluate them and see which ones seem to be better suggestions. And then we can also provide reconstructions of our own, which we have not yet done because we are still compiling our database. But in the future, hopefully I will be able to come back and present some good results for you. So just go back to the end of the presentation. To go. Let me do it this way. Sorry, it's not going. Anyway, it was the end of the talk anyway, so I was just going to say thank you to everybody for inviting me, for giving me this opportunity. Thank you to Dr. Karnik and Riddhi and Yanashwari for helping me to set up and organize this talk. I really enjoyed doing this, and I hope this has given you all some ideas on how we can talk about and think about games from the ancient world. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, sir. Can you just stop sharing your screen so that we'll be able to see you? Yeah. So there are many questions that have come. Should I read it out to you?
Yeah, if you like.
Okay, so the first question is, have you taken into consideration or studied the excavation reports, especially the Harappan ones that report on the games and the gamesmen? What about the Indian Literature Review?
Yes, so the Harappan games are something that I'm very, very interested in because of this connection, especially with the royal game of Ur from Mesopotamia. Right now, because of the pandemic, I'm unable to really consult a lot of sources because our library doesn't have a very large archaeological collection. So I have to get them from other places. But that is something that is very high on my to-do list and something that I'm very interested in. Yes.
The question continues, sir. Also, what about the mythological aspects to cross-reference the use of rules of games? You said that it is a peer-to-peer relationship when it comes to learning of games. It may also be taught by elders of the family. Is this factor taken into consideration?
The fact that they might be taught by members of the family?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we're not we're sort of taking that as a given. We're not modeling the difference between of how a game changes within a culture necessarily. We might do that as it accumulates over time. But it's really, we're just kind of assuming that people learn games from someone that they know, whether that's a parent or a friend or someone that they are meeting when it comes from across cultures. We just don't, I think, have the amount of evidence at this point to be able to say if there's any kinds of difference for what we're doing for historical games. That would be something for, I think, anthropologists to look at in more recent societies where they could get at that kind of data, I think.
There's a question, what about the mythological aspects to cross-reference the use in the rules of games?
Mythological, I'm not sure.
Okay, so the next question is, how were you able to tell that the two people on the ship are playing a board game?
So, well, that's a good question. That's what Egyptologists have interpreted that as. The gestures that they're making are very similar to the way that how people in pictures and paintings and tomb reliefs are making the same gestures when they're playing games. And in those, they have the caption that says people playing Senate or people playing whatever game. So it's clear in the paintings that it's whatever game they're playing. And then when it's in sculpture, people are doing the same thing. So like, it's always some kind of interpretation that's going on, obviously. And we kind of take that into consideration with our uncertainty factors, where one of our uncertainty factors is that the game isn't named. So that kind of can mean that it might not even be a game, but it's our interpretation of what it is.
Okay, so the next question is, do you know if the game that you have recorded is still played? Like you mentioned a game called Teruchu, which was recorded in 1921, but it is not recorded in the 1999 Indian Board Games Survey.
Yeah, so so it might not be played anymore. This is something that is interesting for us because we also are trying to kind of gear this project toward cultural heritage, reconstruction, and kind of preservation. So if people are no longer playing this game, then it's a way that maybe people could start to play it again, or if people do play this game, then they see it there, they can say, oh no, we play this game differently now. Or so it gives us the opportunity to connect with people and hopefully to improve some of what we know about the games.
The next question is, was Ludus always played as an 8x8 board?
No, it was not. So the boards that we have found from Roman sites are on many different, it's always some kind of square or rectangle, and it actually is often an uneven proportion. So it's often an 8x7 rectangle or an 8x10 or 9x8. It's often not an 8x8 like you would see in chess, which is always 8x8. So there is a lot of variation in the game, and part of our reconstruction has to take that into consideration, that it has to work on all these different kinds of boards. So that's kind of an interesting aspect of it.
So there are many people who are thanking you for a fascinating lecture.
Well, I'm glad everybody
there's another question. It says you must be aware of archaeogaming. There's a slight difference in what you're doing and what is generally thought of as archaeogaming. It may not be true, but what do you think?
Yes, it is. I'm presenting a paper at a now it's going to be a virtual conference in November with the archaeogaming people. And for anyone who doesn't know what archaeogaming is, it's people who study archaeology in video games. So that can be ancient cultures that are represented in video games and what that means for archaeology. It could be archaeologists that are characters in video games. it can be, there are all kinds of aspects that people study of this, and we overlap in a way with them because we are offering a representation of the past in an online digital playing format. So it's kind of a different thing than archaeogaming has done in the past, but they are, but it's something they haven't taken into consideration very much what ancient games themselves are. They're more focused on modern games and how it represents the past. But it is an interesting overlap that I think we're going to start exploring.
Okay, so the question continues. Would you say that your project can be considered as archaeogaming? If not, why?
I think it can. There was one of the archaeogaming people wrote a blog that they wanted to expand the field to also include studies of ancient games. So I think they want to include this kind of stuff in their field. And I think that there is an absolute overlap and relationship that there's shared issues that we can discuss. So yeah, I think it can be considered part of it, archaeogaming.
Okay, so there's a next question. LK Rogers' daughter for this.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? It broke up a little bit.
Okay, have you consulted LK Rogers' daughter for this?
Oh yes, yeah, I know her. I've met her a few times. Yeah, she has all this great data from Vijayanagara, and her thesis also on Mohenjo-Daro and Harappan stuff was what I read when I did my PhD thesis. So yeah, I've been in contact with her, and yeah, she's doing a lot of good work.
Okay, so the next question is there a possibility to discover a different mechanic being used to play the game? For example, maybe the game didn't use any dice whatsoever.
Yeah, this is something that we are definitely going to evaluate. So for instance, one of the ancient Egyptian games, Mehen, which we have in our database and you can play it, we don't know if it was played with dice. So it was never found with any dice. It was shown in a painting with another game that has dice, but it's unclear if the dice were shared between the two games. So we can introduce dice into a game and see if it works, and do things like that to see, and try different kinds of dice and see if certain kinds of dice work better with the game. Yeah, that's something that we will probably have to do a lot, I think.
There's another very interesting question. Writing or transcripting the rules is quite challenging. So usually the writer will assume that the reader will already know some basic concepts. So how do you overcome this problem?
Yeah, it's really difficult. And so what we're doing is I'm only documenting what is explicitly said. So it's coming to my awareness that a lot of people, especially because I'm dealing a lot with European sources who are writing about games from other cultures. And in their descriptions of these games, they often will reference European games and say, oh, this is like this European game with these exceptions or whatever. But it's kind of unclear how much the game that the Europeans are describing are like the European game. Does it have exactly the same rules, or are they talking about it broadly? So what we're documenting as evidence is something that's explicitly said about a game. So if they're leaving out things that are kind of understood, we're kind of leaving that out, and that'll be part of the reconstruction. This also gets into ideas of etiquette in games. I'm finding that a lot of things that we consider rules, especially from the game designers that I work with, who kind of have to conceptualize every scenario in a game and what the rule is for when that happens. That's to be able to program it and make it work digitally. It's not something that people often actually thought about in traditional games for these kinds of scenarios that come up rarely. It's something that they kind of dealt with etiquette. Like if there's there's a way that you can kind of manipulate the rules so that you can kind of force some person to lose or force yourself to never lose, kind of gives you, there's a cultural aspect, a social aspect to that, where you don't want to do that because the other player is going to hate you for it. So yeah, there are all these kinds of things that we deal with and trying to piece together what the rules are. Yeah, it's difficult.
The next question is, when one arrives at the probable game rules through the use of artificial intelligence, is there a sense of personal achievement, or does one credit the software with the achievement?
Well, we haven't done it yet, so I'll let you know when that happens. But I think it will be a part of a personal achievement, because it's not just the computer that's doing it. We'll be choosing what the computer does. So we will have chosen what ludemes to fill in the holes. We will choose which artificial intelligence algorithm to use. So it will be the product of a bunch of choices that we have made, and hopefully the computer will be able to tell us that our choices were correct. That's how I think how we will look at it.
The next question is, any resources on application of ancient games in building game-based learning?
So we are actually working with, I'm sure that there are some sources out there. This hasn't really been my focus, but there's another project in the Netherlands, Playing with the Past, at Leiden University, who are really interested in this, and we've had some discussions with them about partnering with them and using some of our reconstructions for their project. And they're really interested in using games for learning about the past and using ancient games for learning other things. So it's the Past at Play Lab. If you're interested in that, you can Google them. I think they have information online. They're another interesting project that's focusing more on that kind of stuff.
So there are many people who would like to attend the November virtual conference.
So that conference is it's an archaeological conference. It's broader. It's not really a games conference, it's an archaeology conference, and I don't know if it's open to the public. I'm having a meeting this week with them, so I can see how available it is. Usually it's one of these archaeology conferences where you have to register and pay money. So it's kind of, it would be nice if it was public, but I can find out.
Yeah, so once you find out, you can send us the link, probably the registration link, and then we'll forward it to the audience.
Yeah, I will.
So there are many, many people who are thanking you for this fascinating lecture.
Thank you.
The next question is, do you find inscriptions in the same context or surface as the archaeological evidences of games, for example, on rock floors? If yes, then what are they usually about, like rules of games or ritualistic associations?
So the only examples that I can think of where there are inscriptions and games together are, well, I'm actually trying to think. So the fast answer is no. It's really uncommon for this to happen. I don't even think that there are any Egyptian tombs where you have inscriptions on the walls where there was also a game found in the tomb, because these are mostly looted tombs where you find the inscriptions, unfortunately. So that's something that is kind of missing, which is unfortunate. But we do find games from some places where there are other artifacts where we can tell about what things were going on there. And often it seems to be a lot of eating and drinking with games, which is similar to what happens today. There are some indications that some of these ancient games were ritual. The Senate game from Egypt is absolutely has religious significance. It's the whole layout of the board is a model of the journey from death into the afterlife for the Egyptians. So these games do have different kind of social context that we can get from the archaeological evidence, but texts found with games they're very, very rare.
The next question is, how do you find out the gender of the players? Since sources, especially the textual ones, usually mentions the rules or the way it was played rather than who was playing it.
Yeah, so it depends on what the source is. So for instance, there was that painting I had of the women playing the Mancala game from Turkey. So in art, you might see a picture or a statue of something of women or men playing a game, and that can tell you something about the gender. Sometimes you will find in text will talk about, if it's telling a story about people who played games. For instance, I'm trying to think of one. Well, for instance, one of the Roman sources talks about, from Ovid, talks about, it's giving advice to a man for how to, what he should do to impress a woman, basically, to then become his wife. And it tells him how he should play some games, not in explicit detail, but basically says, let her win if you want her to be your wife. So that tells us that men and women play games. So it's from hints like that we get at the gender. They're not always explicit, they're not always talked about. And often when they're talked about, they're focused on men because that's what people in history often wrote about and made art about. So it's definitely biased, but it is useful when we can get it.
The next question is, ancient games and the variants proposed, has their algorithm complexity been evaluated?
We haven't really gotten into we haven't done the reconstructions yet. So we haven't done any kind of analysis like that at this point. We're still we just finished engineering the software, the playing software, as of 2 weeks ago, and we're still compiling our games database. So we're not at that stage yet.
The next question is, why is the gender important in a game?
So this again it relates to how people interact with one another. So in many societies in history, and just the ways that social interactions happen between cultures, when a trader from one culture comes to another place, the kind of gender roles that people play within cultures determine who can interact with whom. So for example, a lot of the evidence we have about games is from ethnographies is based on what we know about men, because European men who went to these other societies and learned about what these people did, learned what men did. And so they know about the games that men were playing. And there's been this kind of idea that women don't really play games that much, but that's not true. We know in many cultures, often when there was a woman anthropologist that went to a culture, she would learn the games that women played. So it's about who is interacting with whom. And if someone from an outside culture is coming to another culture and there's a game that only women play that we can tell from artistic or textual evidence, then we might expect that game would not travel to another culture. And it could happen vice versa. If women are traveling to another culture, they might not be allowed to interact with men. It's another factor that we can take into consideration. It's not necessarily a one-to-one correlation, but it's definitely something that we need to be considering when it's happening. Yeah.
Next question is, a lot of old games are not just games, but are also branches of traditional art forms. So AI may take over the physical forms of these crafts as they are easier to access and cheaper and render the art extinct. But on the other hand, they can reach more people and stop the games from going extinct. So can you suggest a way about it?
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely a concern. And I think it's a way that our project isn't on its own going to be something that preserves cultural heritage and shouldn't be the only way that that games are preserved. Projects like Project Kelia and other organizations in different countries like Mexico and South Africa and some of these other places have indigenous games organizations that that encourage people to learn these old games that have kind of been abandoned. So it's about, so our project is kind of one part of it. It should not be the whole thing, right? It should be in consideration with, you know, local places where the game was or still is played. And maybe they can take inspiration from some of the games that we have found in these obscure sources from the past and reincorporate it with current traditional art forms or reviving old traditional art forms. There's definitely collaboration, I think, that this is an opportunity for to continue that, because keeping the games and the art forms both continuing is really important. Yeah, so that's a really great question and an important one.
Okay, so is your project global or limited to a specific area of the globe? Are also culture studies with the way of playing these games a part of it?
So yeah, we're globally focused. We have games from all continents except for Australia, which we don't seem to have any traditional games documented from Australia. From the Aboriginal populations of Australia anyway. But from Pacific Islands, Africa, South and North America, Europe, Africa, Asia, all over. We are globally focused. And Calder, I don't completely understand the question about the current way of playing the games, but there is more to a game than just the mechanics of the game and how the board looks and the history of the game, right? There's the etiquette that I already mentioned. There are part of my research before this focused a lot on materials of games, and people choose materials to make certain games for certain reasons. So there was a study of the game of backgammon in Greece, where traditionally people played on wooden boards with hard glass pieces, and then people started making leather covered boards, and people hated them because they don't make the right sound to play. You have to play with this loud sound, and it has to do with performance and all of this kind of stuff. So that's something that's hard for us to replicate in software like this. So again, that's part of the collaboration that is kind of necessary between the software side and the actual traditional manifestation and action and performance of playing. Yeah.
So we take the last two questions.
Okay.
There are many names for similar games, like Mancala may have 700 different names, and the ways also with slight differences. So
Yes.
How will they be accounted?
So yeah, so what we are doing is, so we have lots and lots of Mancala games. Mancala games, we're considering a family of games. We call it sowing because that's what the action of moving the seeds around the board is called in English. But we have aliases, what we call them, for games in the database, where we can record an infinite number of names for a game. So we take a game, we identify one name that we're going to use as its kind of main name, the one that's usually the most popular as best as we can identify it, and then list all of the other names that we know were used for that. And people can search for that if they know that name for the game. So it gets difficult, but we are, at this point, we're keeping games separate as possible, meaning that games that have similar rules that are that are really close to each other, we are considering them as different games at this point, because it's more helpful for our analysis to do it that way. So even if games share the same name, we are often considering them two different names because they're played differently in different places. There's also a cultural aspect to that they're often in different locations or different times. So yeah, that's something that we are considering.
The last question for today. Do you think the games people play today would possibly project a sense of culture to archaeologists 1,000 years later?
Well, that depends on if they survive, because so many games are made out of cardboard now. But yeah, there's some like the games that are being invented, even though they're a different phenomenon because they're boxed all together and the rules are there and there's less kind of variation, although it does happen. I think like the subjects about what games are about, like Monopoly, for instance, tells something about capitalism in the world and how Monopoly spreads around the world and where it's from and all that kind of stuff. And all these other games, like what the focuses are about, like trading resources and Settlers of Catan or all these other things. So if these things do survive for another 1,000 years, then yeah, I think that it actually might be easier because the games are a little bit more complex and are conceptualized more as a reflection of something concrete or a society. Like Monopoly is about renting and paying money. Settlers of Catan is about, controlling resources and this kind of stuff. They have like a more concrete concept than some of these other abstract games that were traditionally played.
Okay, so I have posted an email ID on the chat. So if there are any more questions, then you can mail it to us and then we'll mail it to Walter sir. And he, according to his convenience, can answer them. Kurush sir, would you like to take it ahead?
So thank you very, very much, Walter. And that was an absolutely amazing exposition, I should say.
Thank you very much.
Not just a talk. And I mean, I have so many questions in my head, but I wanted to make sure that everybody else, who's attending this as the hosts, we should not hog the questions. But one question I must ask, what about pasteboard games? Why are pasteboard games not considered board games? Because they're played specifically on a surface.
I'm not pasteboard games. I'm not sure.
Card games. Card games.
Oh, I did not mention that. We have been focusing on board games at the moment because that's what our software is best at doing right now. But we will be including card games and we will be including dominoes games as well. These absolutely do fall under the umbrella of our project, and we will be including those.
Okay, that will be very interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you very, very much, Walter, for coming here and, coming here virtually and talking to our audience about this. And we're just so happy to have had you here. And there's so many new ideas I'm sure that people are thinking of. And I know that you're going to get inundated with a whole lot of emails, which you're going to probably hate us for, so don't hate us too much.
No, that's why I wanted to. I'm glad that everyone enjoyed it and that you enjoyed it, and that was kind of the purpose. Is I'm really interested in getting feedback from everyone studying games in India, because you know all this stuff about the Indian games. I'm learning stuff about Indian games from British people from 100 years ago. So. So I'm really interested in the feedback and what we can learn from each other. Yeah, I'm really excited about that.
So on behalf of all of us at InstaSen officially, thank you very, very much. And we look forward to many, many more interactions with you.
Yes, I do too. Thank you all so much.
Take care. Good day. Riddhi, will you take it away and shut it down for the day?
Yes, sir. Thank you, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.